The elements and principles of design. These are really kind of the building blocks of design theory. They're, in many ways, they're the grammar of visual art and design, and therein lies the problem. I don't know about you, but I did not enjoy any lessons on grammar when I was in school. I enjoyed greatly talking about how to say something, how to say it better, what was the structure when it mattered, but the idea of walking through each one of these one at a time tends to lead to a very dull class about halfway through the course. So how about if we understand that what we're doing is we're building a thought process, and these things are simply the tools we're going to use as we build a design and compositional theory. All right, so that's how this is going to work, and let me move you to a reminder screen. This should look familiar to all of you. It's a snap from a previous lecture, and herein you're going to find how design theory actually interacts with this list of elements and principles of design. You're going to find them showing up here. Very simply, under form and under concept. In one, you theorize how you're going to use them. In the other, you put them to work. You adjust them, you tweak them, you modify them to work the form and the concept together, right? And these things are balanced by the content and context of the work. So here we go. When we use the word elements, we are talking about what we might understand as the building blocks of art and design. And when we talk about the principles, we are talking about how those things then get used, applied, or restricted in some way, and modified, managed. Use the verbiage you want to use there. And here they are, the building blocks of design, elements. Line, shape, light, color, texture, space, time, and motion. Good, we're all done, right? Now I'm going to give you a quick example of each one. When we talk about line, here's a very nice drawing by Goya. As we walk through it, you can find a number of things at play. Actual line shows up in the way that shoe is drawn, for example, in the cuff of the pant. It's a simple linear mark scrolled across with that brush. We want to talk about implied line or psychological line. You're looking at things like psychological lines suggest the way an eye looks. Typically, we tend to glance in whatever direction any human form looks, just to see what's there. And guess what? There's nothing there. We just look right off the edge of that shoulder. Because why? The guy who's looking in that direction is no longer with us. We can also look at the implied lines created by both looking down and by that hand pointing towards the ground. They tend to create movement in that direction. Lines formed by edges. Well, there's one right along the edge of that brown to the cream white of the paper. All right. When we talk about shape, we can talk about a number of things in Hokusai, but this is a very simple here. The organic, like the shape of that wave. The geometric, the boats that are trapped in those two waves. There's two boats there. You see one slightly to the right in the background and one closer to us off to the center and left. And then the implied line of that wave coming down on what is actually Mount Fuji, this great big dramatic thing, which changes your whole sense of perspective on the thing. But that's another element. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's light. And so here we're going to talk about it in a number of ways. The actual light is the light being emitted by light bulbs, by the skylights in the ceiling, etc. The implication of light is the light that is suggested in a visual art form. So we're looking at a photograph of the Chicago Stock Exchange. Now, the stock exchange itself interacts with the light bulbs in the ceiling and the skylights coming through. It's a very beautiful space. It's awesome. But we're looking at a photograph, so everything we're looking at is really implied light. It's the suggestion of light showing up on the surface. Now, what I'll also point out to you is if you are looking at a computer monitor, you're looking at actual light because that thing is a light source. Whereas when we're looking at a painting or a drawing, we're looking at implied light. When we're looking at a photograph, implied light. When that photograph is on a piece of paper, it's implied light. When it shows up on your screen, we have to actually deal with both actual and implied light. There, did I make it complicated enough for you? Great. Then there's also the warm versus cool. And that tends to create mood. Is the light casting towards blue or casting towards a yellow-green, right? Ambient light. That's the light that tends to fill a space. And here we would be talking entirely about three-dimensional space, not about a two-dimensional surface. And directional light is just simply that, a harsh light coming from one direction. Color, probably the most complicated thing we need to talk about. Here's a fancy color wheel. We can talk about a number of color theories, but this color wheel is really arranged around the standard Newtonian three-primary system, and it works like this. The primaries are red, yellow, blue. You mix red and yellow and you get orange. That's a secondary color. You mix orange with yellow and you get an orange-yellow. That's a tertiary color. Got it? It's that simple. Now, it's not that simple. If we are talking about CMYK, it's the way most of your inkjet printers work and the way some color films used to work. Cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Here's the story. The printing industry wanted to be able to print full color, so they started printing using Newtonian three-primary system, but some things got muddy because of the way pigments interact and colors overprinted. So they went to a system that added green and violet to the system and became a 5-primary plus the black. That was 6 printings instead of 4. That was a 50% cost increase in the printing production. So while it produced really gorgeous images, it cost too much. So they went back to the drawing board, so to speak, and came up with the idea that if we used cyan, which is kind of a blue-green, and then magenta, which is kind of a violet-red, and yellow, and K for black. I know, that's just so you don't confuse it by using B for blue. Yeah. Anyway, those 4 become the printing method. And why? Because the colors that are lost in using those primaries are visually difficult to see. So in a printed surface, they don't show very well anyway. Your eye doesn't respond to them as well. Now, all of that is assuming we are talking about works on a two-dimensional surface, like a piece of paper, a canvas, something flat, right? The minute we move into what you're looking at right now on a screen, because you're looking at a monitor, you're looking at actual light, and it is constructed of different primary systems, red, green, and blue, and that has to do with the physics and the wavelengths of those light sources. Those 3 colors mix together to create all the other colors. So actually, to get yellow in actual light, you mix red and green. I know, messes up your whole thinking of color theory, and grade school just went right out the window. Why did I even go? I get it. But there it is. Now, for the most part, the only time you're going to deal with RGB is when you're working on a computer, or perhaps when you're working with video or photography, and you're staying in that medium. The minute you want to go to the print media, you're going to flip into CMYK and convert anyway, just so you know. So for our purposes, we'll be aware of both, but we're probably just going to stay in conversations surrounding the Newtonian three-primary system and all of its derivatives and color harmonies that come with it. Now, when we talk about color, we talk about 3 basic components. The most commonly expressed way to talk about that is hue, value, and intensity or saturation. Hue is red, the fact that it's red. Value is the lightness or darkness of that, not the intensity, not how red it is. That's intensity. But how close to white or black it is on the value scale, that's value. Right? So you have a hue, and then you have a value and an intensity of each. All right? That's it. Those are the components. So when we talk about color, those are the things we're going to talk about. And then a color harmony is a way of restricting what you're doing. Most common are to do things like complementary color scheme. Now, that doesn't mean the colors make each other look good. That means they're opposite one another, and they tend to make each other stand out. So red and green, opposite each other on the color wheel, complements. Blue and orange. Violet, yellow. Right? That's one way to handle color, just work with those complementary colors. The more common things are to work with a triadic color scheme or to work with analogous colors. So we work with a whole host of colors that, let's say we pick red and we'll work with orange and violet red to create the bulk of our composition. What that does in harmony is it tends to make things look good together. We'll come back to that later under the principles. So as we look at Monet here, he restricts his palette in such a way that he uses a large variety of blues in the skies and in the mountains beyond, and even in the shadows of the trees. There's no black in this image whatsoever. He's an impressionist painter, so he stays away from the tube of black paint and creates his darks by building up a variety of colors. If we look in the lower part of the composition, where he's painting a field of poppies, he's trying to pick up on the red and the green juxtaposition. The red in there is actually pretty muted for the most part. He's relying upon the green to make the red pop off and to create masses of red with small brush strokes. And he hits highlights with white. So he's actually managed the color spectrum very, very carefully to create that red and orange of the poppy field by using the green and the blue complementary color scheme. There you go. Texture. Two kinds of texture, actual and implied. Actual texture means you can run your fingers across the surface and you feel some change in the surface. That's it. Implied texture, then, as we look at a sculpture, is perhaps something painted upon it or a pattern depicted on it. All right? So if we go back to the previous Monet painting, it had a texture to it that was actual, but most of the texture was suggested by the way the paint was applied. Space. Van Gogh's bedroom. One of three versions. And here we're looking at a bedroom that suggests the illusion of space. We get the sense that those pictures are still hanging off the wall a little bit, like the string is loose, and it is. We get a linear perspective coming on as though the space converges at a distance, which it does here. We also get an atmospheric perspective. The imagery outside the window is hazy and fuzzy because it's at a distance. It makes it fall back away from us, whereas things in the foreground are crisp and outlined and easy to see. We talk about compositional space. We are then talking about the space of the painting here itself. How big is that, and how big is that bed, and where is it located in the image, that sort of thing. Dimensional space is reserved really for talking about a three-dimensional object, not totally relevant here. And then there's time and motion. Time and motion can be depicted as follows. In this piece, we get the implication of motion. Why? Because the boat is at an awkward angle that it shouldn't be at. It's leaning in the water. The waves are rolling up. There's a lot of dramatic, unsettling angles. And, sticking that shark in there, we all know sharks don't like take naps on the side of boats, right? So that's what Homer's painted here. There are two kinds of time, though, that you really have to deal with in the visual arts. One is linear time, which means it has a start and a finish. And in this fashion, in this way, we're talking about things like videos and film, where they have a start and a stop. Paintings don't really have that. Paintings are what we call presentational in nature. Everything's there at once. Now, that doesn't mean you notice everything at once. The artist can manage some of that. But all of the information is there in a single image, and it stays there for as long as you care to look at it. The discovery process across it is somewhat controlled by the viewer. It's stimulated by the artist, but the viewer has a large control over how long they stay with the work, what they study in the work, what they find interesting in the work, where their eye holds in the work, and when it moves. And this makes time one of the most complicated things an artist has to deal with. Now we move on to the principles of design. We've talked about those things and we hedged at some of the ways we might use them, but here it is, 5 ways of using them. We use those elements to create a sense of unity and variety or harmony, making things look like they go together, but at the same time, not so boring that we don't want to look at it or it looks like wallpaper, right? Focal point or emphasis if there's more than one focal point, because focal points doesn't really make sense. That's where your eye is drawn to. Balance. In very simple terms, how do we make the image look like it's not falling off the wall or lopsided? That's it. Scale and proportion. Scale being the size of the work, proportion being the size of shapes within the work. Rhythm or pattern. Rhythm just suggests a very regular system, and so does pattern. Rhythm has kind of a musical feel to it, but essentially the same thing. It's the repetition of form to create a pulsation or a movement through the work. Take a fast look here. Unity and variety. When we talk about this particular work by Cezanne, we can look at the way he unifies the work by restricting the palette and using a consistent kind of brushstroke. There's only one or two sizes really of brush strokes throughout the work. It's either a big broad flat and then there's a small sharp rounded tip brush that he's using. He limits his color scheme, and somewhat that's because he's using watercolor, and so the tendency is to not overmix colors anyway and just let them overlap. He has subject matters also. The imagery he's using tends to have something to do with itself. So he's got a watermelon, pomegranates, and various serving utensils that might appear on a table. And we see the front of this composition, oddly enough, is the edge of the table. And so he juxtaposes this and he creates some uncommon perspective, which is part of what's interesting about Cezanne's work, typically of this period, is that we're looking at things that are very common objects, but at very uncommon angles. I can talk about focal point and emphasis. There are lots of ways of managing that. In this particular work, Boccioni draws our attention to a movement kind of thing that's flickering across this by the way the shapes are made. But he also pulls us in particular to the point at which the figure on the right is looking down and both hands are pointing at something. Probably it's holding a pickaxe and they're trying to fix the street. And you find the same thing with a hammer and hands on the far left center. Those things tend to draw our attention. Everything else is just busy movement, which is the point of the work. And then there's balance. How do I talk about all these forms of balance in one work? Well, I'm going to try it here. You've got symmetry, which suggests that everything on one side is the same as everything on the other. You can find an axial arrangement of it in some kind. And if you run an axis right up the center of that vase, you pretty much get a balanced shapes on one side kind of match the same as the other. So big picture, it's a fairly symmetrical composition. However, asymmetry is really at play here. That vase is slightly off center, and to compensate for that, on the right-hand side, there's a cluster of flowers that pull just a little bit more assertively towards the right than everything else, right? And there's one that's falling down towards the right lower. And that tends to make us feel as though that vase is pulling in that direction, even though it's really a tiny bit off center. Radial composition means that everything seems to emit from one point. And we can play that game a little bit with this one and suggest that the flowers and their stems seem to emit from the same place and create sort of an explosion, which then creates a focal point within the work. And we can talk about a crystallographic composition as well, as if there is an even density. And that's really what's happening, not with the whole work, but certainly with the background. The suggestion of a plane is very minimal. Scale and proportion. Scale and proportion. This one is actually a very large painting. It's about 5 feet tall. Geraldine Russell does a painting here, or just a painting of Geraldine Russell by John White Alexander. And his painting here takes that little girl and puts her up above our eye level. So we're actually looking way up at her. He puts us down. Our eye level is down around her ankles. Now that may be because we're standing down the hill a little, but I don't think a hill alone would get us there. We're looking up at her, changes the way we think about her. She's no longer subordinate or weak or a child necessarily. Suddenly there's a wisdom that comes with what she's doing and an insight, and we see her in a much more poetic fashion. Perhaps innocent, perhaps idealistic as well. And we get to pattern and rhythm. And it's easy to talk about here because there's a very lovely high bridge in New York, and we see the arcs repeated from that bridge, not only within the bridge as a structure, but in the water itself, right? That tends to create a pattern, a rhythm, and as that rhythm opens up and clarifies, it gives us a focal point. As it becomes foggy, it dissipates away.